Hi, and welcome to our devotional time. I hope that you enjoy this time. I hope that this has been productive for you or helpful for you in your own Christian walk. Um, I hope that you're safe. I hope that you're well. If you have a need or something like that, or something that the church can help you with, then please reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to do whatever we can for you. Today is the last section. I've had three devotions that all talk about how we're going to use this time as we shelter in place. The first one of those talked about how we're going to use the time, and the second one talked specifically how we're going to use this time with our children. And today I want to turn our attention to how we're going to use this time in our relationship with our spouses. We've talked about that God has given us, that in life we have great opportunities and we have God opportunities. And God opportunities I'm defining as those things that are eternal. There's only two opportunities, only two things in our life that are eternal. One is our relationship with God, and the other one is our relationship with our families. And the question is what are we going to do to improve our relationship with our spouses? Because for some of you, not all of us, but for some of you, this time of being forced to be together has been a challenge because you've never been with your spouse quite this much. If you're working from home or both of you are working from home, it can be quite a challenge because you're getting on each other's nerves. And particularly when you add children to that, it can be a rather challenging thing. When you're used to working by yourself or without all the distractions, that can be stressful. It can be stressful, very stressful. Rarely also do parents parent the same way. Rarely do a husband or wife parent in the same way because they parent based on what was modeled for them as they were children and growing up. Well, every home is a little bit different. Or maybe you're working on a particular project at home and you have different ideas about how that project ought to be done. And so there's a number of different reasons why there could be a lot of stress in the house between mom and dad, between the two of you. And so we want to talk a little bit about that. And this is where Paul's words, God's words to us in Ephesians 5 comes in handy, where God tells us that everybody is supposed to submit to one another. All of us are supposed to submit to one another. And really, that should be our motto for this time in which we are being forced to shelter in place, that we all should submit. We should all put somebody else's needs ahead of our own. In Ephesians, the 5th chapter, Paul gives us some advice. First of all, he says to the wives, he says, I want you to submit to your husbands. But then he turns around and he spends the bulk of that text talking to the husbands, and rightfully so, because we've gotten this wrong for centuries. But he goes on and he tells the husbands, he says, in the same way that wives are supposed to submit to husbands, that you are to love your wives as Christ loved the church. Well, how did Christ love the church? Well, Christ died sacrificially for the church. In other words, I guess the more up-to-date version of interpretation on this passage is that both of us, both the husbands and wives, are to submit to one another. The wife is to submit to the husband, and the husband is to submit to the wife and sacrificially give himself to her in service and loving her. And the illustration that Paul gives in there is he says, okay, in the same way that husbands and wives are to submit to one another and love one another sacrificially. Well, that was modeled for you, that was modeled for us by Christ and his relationship with the church. That Christ, even though he was the Lord of all, even though he was the King of Kings, he gave himself up and he died sacrificially for us, for the church. So that gives us a clue as to how we should relate to one another in this time. How does God view the church? Does he look down on the church and see a bunch of fatally flawed, terribly bad, no good, worthless sinners? No, he doesn't. When God looks at the church, he looks at the church the way the groom looks at his bride on the day that he gets married. And what groom in the right mind, really, what groom in the right mind on the day that he gets married would point out the flaws of his bride. None that I know of that want to be married for longer than 30 minutes. That's how God views us. When God looks at the church, when God looks at us, he doesn't see a bunch of fatally flawed, terrible, no good, imperfect people, even though that's what we are. He loves us. He loves us unconditionally. He looks at us as we are a beautiful bride, his beautiful bride. And it's because of what Christ has done on the cross that he can actually look at us that way. And it's a wonderful thing. And so we have a choice. God's saying to us in the book of Ephesians, you have a choice as a husband and a wife, both of you. You can look at each other, and during this time in which you're forced to be together, maybe more than you'd like, you have a choice. You can continue to look at them and see their flaws and point out their flaws, or you can do the God thing. You can use this as a God opportunity to build that relationship and be thankful for all the ways in which your spouse blesses you and your family. Instead of pointing out your spouse's flaws, you instead appreciate their strengths. You appreciate what made you love them in the first place, what attracted you to them in the first place. You see, when God looks at me, he doesn't see somebody who's fatally flawed, even though I am. He looks at me and he says, you're my son, and therefore you're a saint. Nobody thinks I'm a saint, especially not my wife. And then he looks at my wife and he says, you're my daughter, and you're divine. And that's the approach that we ought to have with our spouses during this time together, of forced togetherness. We need to look at each other the way that God looks at us. We need to remember why we married them. We need to remember why their strengths and not their weaknesses. We need to remember all the ways in which they have blessed the family and they've blessed us, one another. Because that's what God would require of us. That's what God would require of us. The other thing that God gives us, because I recognize that for some of us, we'd say, I can't do that on my own. And you're right, you can't. And that's why I go back to what I've said earlier in the other devotions, is that the only reason we can love like God is because we are spending time with God. The only reason why we can love like the Father is because we're spending time with the Father. And God has given us a promise that the only reason why we can be able to love like this and to be able to see past the flaws and be able to see a child of God, a son or a daughter of God, is because the Holy Spirit is in us. And that's what he's promised. So in these days ahead, do your best to think beyond and ignore the things that annoy you about your spouse, and rather look at them the way that God looks at them. Not as somebody that is faultless, but as somebody that is forgiven and loved. May God bless you.